Hello again, and welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk general aviation with relevant news and flying tips for pilots and student pilots to help keep you safe. I'm Max Trescott. Today we'll be talking about a tragic accident in which a high-time airline pilot who was moving a Cessna 150 across the country died in a fatal accident that also killed his son. And we'll talk about the cascading series of red flags that should have led him to alter his plan. Sadly, he continued on until he was boxed in a corner with no remaining options. Last week in episode 277, we talked with CFI Chris about his accident that occurred on a first flight with a new owner as they were preparing to bring his new aircraft home, and about how external pressures and stress played a role in that accident. And we also had a mailbag episode 278, in which we talked about propeller safety and checklist usage. So if you didn't hear those episodes, you may want to check them out at aviationnewstalk.com/277 and /278. And so that you don't miss next week's episode, go to whatever app you're using to listen to me now. Take a moment right now, touch that subscribe or the follow key so that next week's episode is downloaded for free. And this is a listener-supported show, so if you've been listening for more than a year and have learned a few things from the show, I'd like to invite you to become a member to join the club to support Aviation News Talk. It's really easy to do. Just go out to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome, and you can sign up for whatever contribution level you'd like. And when you do, I'll read your name on the show. And of course, we have a link for that website in our show notes. Coming up in the news for the week of June 12th, 2023, the FAA is slated to approve 91 UL unleaded fuel for much of the GA fleet. NBAA calls for more crew rest for charter pilots. And United has announced plans to fly eVTOLs around a major U.S. city. All this and more, and the news starts now. From avweb.com, FAA to approve use of 91 UL fuel in 2/3 of the piston fleet. The FAA will issue a fleet authorization this year that will allow more than 2/3 of the gasoline piston fleet to operate on 91 UL avgas. In a news conference held to update progress on the development of an unleaded high-octane fuel, Leroy Liu, head of certification for the FAA, said the agency plans to issue the blanket approval as part of the initiative to get rid of lead in avgas. Quote, "We expect approximately 68% of the GA fleet will be able to use the UL91. In addition to reducing lead emissions from piston aircraft, the fleet authorization for UL91 will give a glimpse of a lead-free future for GA aircraft. That will facilitate broader use and experience with the transition," said Liu. From flyingmag.com, NBAA calls for pilot rest rule changes. The National Business Aviation Association, NBAA, is calling for changes to Part 135 pilot rest rules and duty requirements ahead of a new FAA reauthorization bill. In a letter to the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee and Aviation Subcommittee, NBAA President and CEO Ed Boland noted, quote, "Preventing and mitigating fatigue remains a universal area of concern." He urged for changes to Part 135 rest and duty requirements, namely to eliminate tail-end ferries and to require record-keeping regarding the scheduling of both duties and prospective rest. Tail-end ferries refers to flights flown at the end of a duty day that are filed as Part 91, meaning that they wouldn't be subject to Part 135 rest requirements. A pilot could log a maximum duty day under Part 135 and still be able to accept a ferry flight, such as a repositioning flight, under Part 91 that would otherwise exceed allowable duty limits, posing a significant safety risk. These tail-end ferries have been around since Part 135 rest and duty regulations were introduced in 1978, though talk of eliminating tail-end ferries has been resurfacing for years. In 2021, a Part 135 Pilot Rest and Duty Aviation Rulemaking Committee, ARC, composed of certificate holders, legal experts, industry associations, and other stakeholders, laid out recommendations to improve safety through revised rest and duty rules, which include the aforementioned actions. Quote, "The FAA and NTSB recognize that engaging in Part 91 flying after completing a Part 135 duty period of maximum duration poses a substantial safety risk that is deemed unacceptable," wrote Boland. NBAA does not believe that the cost of ending tail-end ferry flights will be significant, as many Part 135 operators already recognize the risks posed by such operations and voluntarily disallow tail-end ferries. In its recommendations, the ARC also urged the FAA to require certificate holders to record rest, duty, and flight times in sufficient detail to determine compliance with the rest, duty, and flight time limitations of Part 135. Quote, while monitoring flight time is an important component of preventing fatigue, it is not the only component. Hence, the regulations stipulate flight and duty limits along with rest minimums. However, the regulation only requires recording the flight time, which is insufficient to ensure flight crews receive adequate, prospectively scheduled rest, Boland's letter stated. Lawmakers have until September 30th to agree on a new FAA reauthorization bill. A markup of the House bill is expected this month, with plans to bring it to the floor in July. From FlyingMag.com, docs filed for Cirrus Aircraft's IPO in Hong Kong. Cirrus Aircraft has filed documents for a $300 million IPO in Hong Kong, according to a report by International Finance Review. The report stemmed from Regulatory Flying accessed by Flying Magazine. Within the filing is language indicating that the company does not intend to register with the Securities Exchange Commission nor solicit U.S. investors. Reading from that document, quote, the securities of the company have not been and will not be registered under the U.S. Securities Act or with any securities regulatory authority of any state or other jurisdiction of the U.S., and may not be offered, sold, resold, pledged, transferred, or delivered, directly or indirectly, into or within the United States, except pursuant to an exemption from or in a transaction not subject to the registration requirements of the U.S. Securities Act. Flying Magazine reached out to Cirrus for comment and received the following statement from the company, which is in a quiet period after the filing. Quote, from time to time, Cirrus Aircraft explores options to raise additional capital. Our current work, made possible by the contributions of the Cirrus Aircraft team, has positioned the company as a global leader in personal aviation. A natural next step in that journey is exploring additional business and capital funding structures that enable even larger and more stable growth ahead. Raising additional capital will allow us to further invest in our people, new product development, production capabilities, facilities, and efficiencies, as well as enable and expand global service capabilities and strengthen our IT and business infrastructures. Cirrus Aircraft merged with China Aviation Industrial General Aircraft, that's CAIGA, in 2011 to fund and support its global expansion. From GeneralAviationNews.com, President signs legislation to modernize NOTAM system. The President signed H.R. 346 on June 3, 2023, a bipartisan law designed to update the FAA's Notice to Air Missions, or NOTAM system. The legislation comes after the NOTAM system crashed in January 2023, grounding domestic flights across the U.S. The NOTAM crash raised questions about the FAA's next-gen program and how long it is taking to implement that modernization. In a February 2023 Senate hearing, FAA Acting Administrator Billy Nolan reported that the agency is about halfway through the modernization of the NOTAM system. Part of that modernization is transitioning the system to standards set by the International Civil Aviation Organization, or ICAO. The modernization is also expected to improve accuracy and accessibility for pilots, according to FAA officials. The modernization efforts are expected to be done by mid-2025, according to Nolan's testimony during the Senate hearing. The new law requires the FAA to set up a task force made up of all representatives of the aviation industry, including general aviation. The FAA also is required to implement a backup system by September 30th, 2024, as well as brief Congress on its plan to improve the NOTAM system. Also from GeneralAviationNews.com, preparation for check ride goes awry. Now this comes from an NTSB report. It says the student pilot and instructor were preparing for the student's private pilot check ride. After performing takeoffs, landings, and several maneuvers, they decided to land at a 1,720-foot private grass strip near Bentleyville, Pennsylvania, which for geography scholars is just south of Pittsburgh, PA. The landing was uneventful, and the student pilot taxied back and prepared to take off with 10 degrees of flaps. During the takeoff, after the Cessna 150 became airborne, the last recollection the student pilot had was that the airplane was not climbing due to, quote, low airspeed in the high heat and high humidity. The airplane hit the runway about 100 feet from trees at the departure end, which resulted in substantial damage to the fuselage and wings. Both the CFI and student pilot sustained serious injuries in the crash. The student pilot reported that they did not complete performance calculations prior to the takeoff. Takeoff performance calculations, based on the takeoff distance chart in the airplane owner's manual, revealed that a ground roll of about 1,022 feet and a takeoff distance of about 1,792 feet was required to clear a 50-foot obstacle at the airplane's maximum allowable gross weight. The chart and the checklist procedure indicated that the maximum performance takeoff was to be performed with the flaps in the retracted position. Probable cause: the flight instructor and student pilot's inadequate pre-flight performance planning, which resulted in a takeoff attempt with insufficient available runway, a loss of control, and impact with terrain. And one thing the story doesn't say is whether or not this calculation for the takeoff distance was based on a grass runway or on hard surface. Typically, taking off from grass adds to the total length of runway required when taking off. From GeneralAviationNews.com, pilot dies after crashing his new Sea Ray. According to the pilot's son, who was also a pilot, he and his father had recently purchased the Sea Ray LSX. The day before the accident, they flew to Payne Field, KPAE, in Everett, Washington to pick up the airplane and flew it back to Logan Airport, KLGU, in Utah. The pilot's son said the airplane was relatively docile, noting it did not have the performance that their Husky airplane had. On the day of the accident, the pilot's son spoke to the pilot and invited him to overfly a house where he would be with friends having a barbecue. The son witnessed the airplane approach the house from the south and recalled the airplane was low, about 500 to 700 feet AGL, and flying about 40 knots ground speed. The pilot waved as he flew past and then turned the airplane to the right, which was toward rising terrain. The son noted that the turn was tight, like how the pilot would fly his Husky airplane. As the airplane was turning, the right wing dropped. The wings then leveled, followed by the left wing dropping. The son observed the wings level again, heard the engine increase in power, and observed the nose pitch up. The airplane began to climb and hit a neighboring house while in a nose-high attitude. The pilot came to rest in the attic section of the house. The pilot died in the crash. Another witness observed the aircraft flying low, about 100 feet AGL, and slow, about 50 to 60 knots. He noted the flight path was erratic as it banked from left to right. He then observed the plane bank sharply to the right, about 45 to 60 degrees, as it turned 180 degrees to the south before it descended behind the house. A third witness reported that the airplane approached what he described as a canyon or bench area above the property and turned right 180 degrees toward terrain. He stated that although the bank angle was not excessive, it was more aggressive than required for a standard rate turn, presumed to avoid terrain. As the airplane rolled out, now on a heading of about 170, the right wing and nose dropped. It appeared that the pilot was attempting a recovery when the left wing dropped and the airplane hit a house. Examination of the engine revealed that both carburetors were excessively fuel-stained on their exteriors, and the rubber flange assemblies located between the carburetors and the aluminum intakes were torn. The carburetor for cylinders number 1 and 3 contained a black substance that stuck to the bottom of the bowl. Examination of the spark plugs revealed they were not correct for the engine and they were not gapped in accordance with Rotax specifications. Additionally, the electrodes appeared worn. The engine was rotated by hand-displayed good thumb compression. The engine turned smoothly and without unusual noise coming from the case. Probable cause: the pilot's loss of airplane control while maneuvering at a low altitude, which resulted in a collision with a house. From AINonline.com, passenger nearly crashes Helitour flight. A viral TikTok video has captured what could have been the final moments of a Grand Canyon Helitour flight had the pilot not acted quickly. The video, which has already garnered 2.7 million views, shows a front seat passenger reaching for the cabin ceiling-mounted rotor brake while the helicopter is in cruise flight. The alert pilot grabs the passenger's arm and pulls it down before the rotor brake could be activated. He loudly admonished the passenger, "No, no, that will kill us." He adds a variety of hand gestures to re-emphasize the point. During pre-flight safety briefings for Helitour flights, passengers are typically warned against touching any flight controls. The 2018 fatal crash of a doors-off Helitour over New York resulted from an intoxicated front seat passenger entangling his safety harness in the floor-mounted fuel shutoff lever of an Airbus AS350B2. Social media reaction to the Grand Canyon video has included a series of remarks suggesting that the pilot should have aborted the flight after the incident. From AOPA.org, Tecnam puts electric twin on ice. Citing the limitations of current and foreseeable battery technology, Tecnam announced it has put development of a twin-engine electric commuter aircraft on hold until batteries of sufficient power and life cycle endurance become available. The Italian airframer spent 3 years working on its largest all-electric aircraft to date before deciding its time has not yet come. The P-Volt, announced in 2020, sought to adapt the P-2012 Traveler, now flying for launch customer Cape Air in New England, for electric airline service. Tecnam's engineers, however, determined that the batteries now available, or foreseeably available in the near future, do not stand up to the energy and financial demands of commercial aviation. Battery packs large enough to replace the fuel tanks, powering twin 375 horsepower engines, would not last long enough to make electric airline service cost-effective, the company concluded. Quote, Tecnam has a deep understanding of electric flight, gained from previous projects such as the H-3PS hybrid aircraft, based on the P-2010 four-seater, and today we have looked closely at the state-of-the-art in energy storage in realistic 5-year developments, excluding technological revolutions that no one can speculate on. Specifically, Tecnam cited the life cycle limits of current batteries, saying, quote, taking into account the most optimistic projections of slow charge cycles and the possible limitation of the maximum charge level per cycle, the real storage capability would fall below 170 watt-hours per kilogram, and only a few hundred flights would drive operators to replace the entire storage unit, with a dramatic increase in direct operating cost due to the reserves for battery replacement prices. Tecnam's skepticism contrasts with the optimism investors have expressed by funding a number of electric aviation projects, though others have drawn similar conclusions, including pilot and physics professor Peter Rez, who has written extensively about the limitations of battery and hydrogen-powered propulsion in aviation. Rez noted in 2018 that the best available batteries fall far short of matching the energy density of gasoline or kerosene. Batteries have not improved dramatically since, and many eVTOL designs include a fixed-wing element to extend range. Rez more recently cast a skeptical eye on hydrogen fuel options, which face different limitations, but, in the view of Rez and fellow skeptics, the same or similar net result. Tecnam's senior research and development officer, Fabio Russo, said the company does not feel compelled to join any, quote, electric rush, and continued, it has been our culture to commit to achieve goals with customers and operators, and we intend to keep that promise. We hope that new technologies will make businesses viable sooner rather than later, and we have real confidence in our partners' ability to bring highly valuable products to the zero-emission powertrain and energy storage arena. From smh.com.au, other aircraft grounded before firefighting crew crashed during Australian bushfires, inquest told. New information is out on a C-130 Hercules firefighting plane that crashed in Australia in 2020, killing all 3 men on board after its crew was asked to drop retardant despite hazardous weather that had grounded other planes, an inquest has heard. Pilot Ian Macbeth, 45, co-pilot Paul Hudson, 42, and flight engineer Rick DeMorgan, 43, all from the U.S., had dropped a partial load of retardant from a low altitude at Peak View in the snowy Monaro region when their plane stalled and crashed about 1:15 p.m. on January 23, 2020. The crash was witnessed by nearby firefighters who rushed to the wreckage and found no survivors. Counsel Adam Casselden said in an opening statement that there had been strong gusty winds in the area, and the plane was probably subjected to wind shear shortly after it dropped some retardant, causing it to crash. A bystander filmed the C-130 Hercules as it flew by, capturing its final 22 seconds. The video showed the plane dropping retardant from 200 feet, banking to the left and becoming obscured by smoke as it slightly gained altitude to 330 feet. It then lost altitude and rolled to the left, hitting the ground. Casselden said that other aircraft at Kuma had been grounded that day due to the hazardous conditions, resulting in the C-130 Hercules and a Boeing 737 being sent from Richmond, northwest of Sydney. A Bird Dog plane, a small aircraft that gathers intelligence on fire conditions and leads larger planes across the fireground, was also tasked, but that pilot refused to take off until a weather report was provided. The 737 arrived in the area first, and the pilot received a wind shear warning while he was circling a nearby fireground. At 12:26 p.m., he radioed the Kuma Control Center to say he was leaving the area. In a later police statement, he said he recommended at this time that all aircraft be canceled. At 12:35 p.m., the 737 crossed paths with the Hercules, and the pilot radioed to Macbeth that he was not returning to the fire due to deteriorating conditions. The last thing Macbeth said was, "I'll go take a look." Laura Henwood, an investigator at the Australian Transport Safety Bureau, said it appears the pilots of the Hercules and the 737 were not told that other planes were not flying due to the conditions. She said there was no evidence of medical, structural, or mechanical failures in the Hercules, and military pilots such as Macbeth and Hudson usually receive training every 2 years on how to recover from wind shear. Henwood said it was likely the plane was so close to the ground when it aerodynamically stalled that it was unable to recover prior to impact. The plane was still carrying about 11 tons of fire retardant when it crashed, but investigators were not able to determine if jettisoning this would have been enough to recover the plane before it hit the ground. The inquest continues. And finally, from FlyingMag.com, Eve Air Mobility and United plan San Francisco-based eVTOL network. Eve Air and United Airlines said they plan to launch electric-powered commuter flights in San Francisco in the next few years. The company has called the announcement a first step in a process that includes coordination with energy and technology providers, as well as state and local officials, to ensure adequate infrastructure is in place to support eVTOL aircraft operations. Eve and United are also working together to develop a network of routes. Andre Stein, co-CEO of Eve Air Mobility, said, quote, "Our shared goal is to provide residents and visitors to the San Francisco Bay Area with efficient and cost-competitive transportation in one of the most densely populated urban areas in the U.S. The Bay Area is perfect for eVTOL flights given its size, traffic, focus on sustainability, innovation, and commitment to add other options for mobility." No mention, though, on the fog. Eve said its eVTOL has a range of 60 miles, allowing it to complete a variety of urban air mobility missions in the Bay Area. Michael Leskinen, president of United Airlines Ventures, said urban air mobility has the potential to revolutionize how United customers work, live, and travel. Eve's proposed route is a critical first step toward making this all-electric and quiet commute a reality for Bay Area residents. In 2022, United announced a $15 million investment in Eve and a purchase agreement for 200 eVTOLs and 200 options as part of a strategy to establish a leadership position in aviation sustainability. Eve's eVTOL is scheduled to enter service in 2026. Well, that's the news for this week. Coming up next, a few of my updates. And later, we'll talk about how an airline pilot's poor decision-making and fatigue led to a fatal Cessna 150 crash. All right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. Well, let's start with the good news. First, congratulations to Michael Ormont. He says, "Thanks, Max. Love the podcast and so happy to help. After 29 years, I am finally officially a Bonanza pilot. Thanks to your guidance, my instrument check ride was smooth, well, at least from my standpoint. It was 90 degrees, very turbulent, and I was sure my DPE was going to throw up, but he held it together." Yeah, so happy that worked out well for both of you, Michael, and thanks too for signing up as a Patreon supporter. Now I'd like to mention a few radio tips. I've been thinking about these over the last few weeks and compiled a few of the ones that I keep encountering. This one was a little embarrassing. I was at the Tracy Airport a week or two ago, and I was doing some pattern work with a client. Now, Tracy is a non-towered airport, and while we were there, we commented to each other how the other pilot in the pattern was not talking on the radio. And I, of course, speculated that he might be on the wrong frequency, which I do hear from time to time there because the frequencies at Byron and Tracy, which are two adjacent airports, are separated by just one click of the small knob, and pilots occasionally end up at the wrong frequency at one of these airports. Anyway, after a lap or two around the pattern, I happened to look at the radio and discovered that, we were the ones who were on the wrong frequency. So if you find yourself at a non-towered airport and you see another plane who's not on the radio, make sure that you're not the one who's on the wrong frequency. Now, I also want to mention that when I'm getting flight following and talking with a client over the intercom in the aircraft, I always stop talking in mid-sentence the moment that ATC starts transmitting. And I'm doing that to check whether they're calling us. If instead you talk continuously on the intercom with each other, it's much easier to miss a radio call. Now, it may sound a little odd to talk like this at first, but if you're in the midst of flight training or there are other conversations going on in the cockpit, using this technique will reduce the number of missed radio calls. Also, I instantly stop talking the moment I hear ATC say the words traffic alert, even if they're calling another aircraft, because the person they're talking about could be you. Now, if there are two aircraft on frequency getting close to each other and you're in one of those airplanes, there's a 50% chance that ATC will call you first to issue the traffic alert, and a 50% chance that they'll call the other aircraft first. So if ATC gives someone else a traffic alert for an aircraft that's, say, at 3,500 feet and you're at 3,500 feet, that should instantly raise alarm bells. Almost all the aircraft that I teach in have ADS-B in, so I usually have that dedicated traffic page displayed when we're in the metro area and there's lots of traffic. And I usually turn on the call sign ID function so that I can see the call signs of other aircraft around me. That also helps me understand which aircraft around me are getting which instruction, which gives me some idea about what each of them is most likely to do next. And here's a radio tip for instrument pilots, or those of you working on your instrument rating. Pilot workload when flying instruments is sometimes very high, and often the biggest challenge I see pilots facing is prioritizing the many things that need to be done and deciding which of those things to do next. Now, unfortunately, pilots are very heavily programmed to follow ATC instructions, and that sometimes gets in the way of doing the highest priority task first. For example, I'll often hear ATC tell an instrument pilot to contact tower, which the pilot then does immediately. They then have a 20-second conversation, which distracts the pilot from some higher priority task. So anytime you need to talk on the radio, before you start talking, check first to see if there's something you need to do in the next 15 to 20 seconds. For example, maybe you need to start a descent, or intercept the final approach course, or intercept the glide slope, or monitor the autopilot for some imminent change in state. So if there is a higher priority task coming up, wait until you're done with that task and only then call the tower. In most cases, the tower doesn't need to hear from you immediately. And if they do, they will call you and you'll hear them if you switch frequencies, but then wait 20 seconds or so before calling them as you deal with a higher priority task. And sad note here, I just wanted to mention that the final NTSB report is out for a crash that occurred 2 years ago, July 13th, 2021, at the Monterey, California airport, which killed my coworker, Mary Ellen Carlin. She was a longtime CFI at the West Valley Flying Club where I teach, and I flew with her one time to get my high-altitude endorsement in the Cessna 421 that she owned, which was the accident aircraft. Let me read from the final NTSB report. It says that the pilot requested a VFR on top clearance, which the controller issued via the Monterey 5 departure procedure. The departure procedure includes a left turn after takeoff. The pilot took off and climbed to about 818 feet, then entered a right turn. The air traffic controller noticed that the airplane was in a right-hand turn rather than a left-hand turn and issued a heading correction to continue a right-hand turn to 030, which the pilot acknowledged. By the way, there are tall mountains off to the right, which is why that departure procedure has an initial left turn. It says the airplane continued the climbing turn for another 925 feet, then entered a descent. The controller issued 2 low-altitude alerts with no response from the pilot. No further radio communications with the pilot were received. The airplane continued the descent until it contacted trees, terrain, and a residence about 1 mile from the departure airport. Review of weather information indicated prevailing IMC in the area due to a low ceiling, with ceilings near 800 feet above ground level and tops near 2,000 feet MSL. Examination of the airframe and engines did not reveal any anomalies that would have precluded normal operation. The airplane's climbing right turn occurred shortly after the airplane entered IMC, while the pilot was acknowledging a frequency change, contacting the next controller, and acknowledging the heading instruction. Track data shows that as the right-hand turn continued, the airplane began descending, which was inconsistent with the clearance. Review of the pilot's logbook showed that the pilot had not met the instrument currency requirements and was likely not proficient at controlling the airplane on instruments. The pilot's lack of recent experience operating in IMC, combined with a momentary diversion of attention to manage the radio, may have contributed to the development of spatial disorientation, resulting in a loss of airplane control. Probable cause? The pilot's failure to maintain airplane control due to spatial disorientation during an instrument departure procedure in IMC, which resulted in a collision with terrain. Contributing to the accident was the pilot's lack of recent instrument flying experience. Now, I do know that Mary Ellen was taking a friend that day and her friend's dog to a veterinarian in Sacramento, And I can't help but wonder if somehow she was distracted as she was taking off with her friend and her friend's dog in the cockpit. Anyway, it shows that even high-time experienced flight instructors sometimes have accidents, which is a sobering thought for me and hopefully for you as well. We need to bring our A game with us every time we fly, as the stakes are just too high. Something we'll talk about later in the hour as we discuss a fatal Cessna 150 accident involving an airline pilot. Here's an email from listener Adam, who wrote, "High-time listener and instrument-certified pilot for fixed wing. I just moved up here to the San Francisco Bay Area from Van Nuys, which is down in Southern California, and I'm looking to finish my multi-engine commercial, but can't seem to find any planes in the area. Any help would be highly appreciated." And I wrote back to him and said, "Welcome to the Bay Area. We have a nice 2021 DA-42-6 for rent in Palo Alto at the West Valley Flying Club, and I teach in that aircraft. The owner just reduced the rate to $475 an hour, which, by the way, is the flight time. That's not Hobbs time. So that means all the ground taxing time and all the run-up time is free, which saves a lot of money since we're not allowed to do touch and goes in that aircraft, and so it does a lot of full-stop taxi back. So all those minutes on the ground are free." Anyway, he wrote back that it's a beautiful airplane, but he was hoping for something in the $300 range if possible. And I said, "No, I'm sorry, I don't know of any twins in that price range. But," I said, "you might find it cost-effective to travel to a school that specializes in multi-engine aircraft and do a 3 or 4 day program to get your multi-engine rating. I did that 20 years ago at Shibley Aviation, which I think is now in Las Vegas. They were in Arizona at the time. And I said that training at a local flight school with just one twin can sometimes take an extended time since the aircraft is often down for maintenance. As an example, the Duchess at another Palo Alto flight school had a nose gear collapse last week at Palo Alto, so the people who are training in it won't be able to complete their rating for many months." And I'd like to give a quick shout out to Patreon supporter Mac Apodaca, as we had kind of a funny encounter. I've flown with him and met him just one time before, and I saw his vehicle at the time, which is distinctive as it's one of the first autonomous vehicles that participated in a DARPA challenge race held about 15 years ago in the Mojave Desert. Now, the goal of that race was to encourage development of fully autonomous ground vehicles. Anyway, a couple of weeks ago, I was being driven by a Vision Jet owner to the Hayward Airport so that we could fly his plane. And we were on Interstate 880, which is a 10-lane highway, and we were in one of the carpool lanes when I noticed that we were passing Mac in his race vehicle. Now, that was quite a coincidence, as it was the morning rush hour on a 10-lane highway in the San Francisco Bay Area with an overall population of about 7 million people. Anyway, I waved at Mac as we drove by, but he didn't see me. So I texted him and wrote, "Just passed you on 880 and waved from the express lane." And he texted back, "Funny, must be telepathic, as I just started listening to episode 273 of the podcast." Funny coincidence there. So anyway, hello again to you, Mac, and good luck on your upcoming private check ride. And here's an email from Mickey in Switzerland. He writes, "Hi, Max. I enjoy your podcast. I really appreciate the calm, logical approach to all your topics. One thing that I think the greater flying community could use is more of your knowledge and experience. You often read interesting news stories, and I think some of the stories merit some editorial comments from you. Sometimes I can see you shaking your head when reading stories, and I think you may be assuming we know what you are thinking, but it may help to spell it out." Yes, Mickey, sometimes I am shaking my head, and sometimes I do jump in and add some commentary on a story, though often I don't, as I want each of you to be thinking about a story yourselves and draw your own conclusions. Anyway, he continues, "The most recent one was the kids that were lost in the jungle, and you might have just reminded people that most of the time it's best to stay with the wreckage after a crash. Thanks for the show and keep up the great work." And Mickey says he flies an RV-8 in Switzerland. Well, Mickey, you are absolutely correct. Most search and rescue people say it's much easier to spot and find an aircraft than it is to find individual people. So yes, in general, it makes sense to stay near aircraft wreckage. And here's an email from patron supporter Bob Luton. He says, "Max, since you've been a pilot continuously since First Solo for over 50 years, are you aware that you're eligible for the FAA Wright Brothers Master Pilot Award? Regards, Bob." Bob, yes, I'm familiar with the award. Some friends of mine have received it, but of course I am much, much too young to get that award. Seriously, though, I always thought that the 50-year clock started from the time you achieved your private certificate. And I went and looked up the criteria, and what I discovered is the effective start date for the 50 years is the date of the nominee's first solo flight, which indeed did happen way back in 1973, which was 50 years ago. So yes, I will apparently qualify for this later in the year. Now, if I had to wait for 50 years of helicopter time, then obviously I'd have to wait for another 50 years to apply for that award. And here's an email from Mega Supporter Stephen Bush, who we've had on the show talking about helicopters. He says, I just want to provide an update. I've increased my offering to the pilot community. He, by the way, is a CFI who teaches in his Robinson R44, and he does a lot of initial helicopter and also fixed-wing add-on ratings. He says, I've been a Robinson and insurance-approved check airman now for years, but I'm now able to provide all Bell 206 series insurance, audit training, and flights now for recurrency through initial training. So thanks for that update, Stephen. That's great. And here's a note from Patreon Mega Supporter Eric Himes, who I mentioned briefly in the past, and I said I would tell you a little bit more about him in the future. He writes, Max, I just jumped in for a long overdue sponsorship. I run a brand new nonprofit, Hope on Short Final, which does emergency relief supply flights in response to weather disasters. Our most recent flight was to Northwest Mississippi. More on our mission at hopeonshortfinal.org. Love the show and really appreciate what you do for GA. Eric, thanks for all your good work, and I'll include a link in our show notes to hopeonshortfinal.org. And here's an email from Mega Supporter Tim Crawford. He says, thought you might get a laugh out of this. My hangar neighbors, Marty and Joe, put together a song about pilots that don't go anywhere. They are a retired group of self-proclaimed hangar rats that spend most of their days putzing around the hangar. Hope you enjoy this. And I'll include a link to that in the show notes. I really enjoyed it, and I might have included a portion of it here, but I noticed part of the music bed was owned by NBC/Universal, and unfortunately I can't play their music here on this podcast. But check out the link to that YouTube video, which will be in our show notes. And a quick thank you to the supporters who've joined us in the past 2 weeks. They include 2 new Mega supporters. Derek Doyle, who signed up at the $50 a month level. Looks like he's in Europe since it came through in euros. And David Ford, who edited his pledge up to $50 a month. And we also have regular supporters, Jim Overton at the $20 a month level, and David Sindram, also $20 a month. Maurice Gunderson headed his pledge up to $35, Brian Geimrich at $8 a month, and Jonathan Hall at $20 a month. We also had several one-time donations, thanks to Anson Chappelle for $15. We read one of his emails recently, and this one is kind of fun. I like this. David Ford donated $680, and you might wonder why $680? He says, hello, Max. I just upgraded my Aviation News Talk membership to $50 per month and made an additional donation of $680. Why $680? Earlier this week, I passed my private pilot check ride just after my 68th birthday. I consider your podcast to have been an essential component of my learning experience and anticipate that it will be even more important now that I have that license to learn. I can't imagine how you find the time and energy to produce the podcast, but I'm so grateful that you did. My principal CFI, Kat Emery, recommended the podcast early on. She and the great team at Aero Elite Flight School at Leesburg Executive Airport, JYO, figured out how to get an old guy across the private pilot finish line. Many thanks to you and them for helping to create safer pilots. David, congratulations. That's great that you passed your check ride at age 68. Hopefully I'll be mentioning a helicopter check ride in my future at age 66, so there is hope for us older folks. And if you've been listening to the show for a year or more, hey, why don't you join some of these other folks who are longtime supporters? Go ahead and sign up to support the show, become a member, join the club by going out to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome, since you're all awesome listeners, or to make a one-time donation, go out to aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal. Coming up next, that Cessna 150 accident we've been talking about, all right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And now let's talk about an accident that highlights how external pressures, fatigue, and poor decision-making can doom even a high-time professional pilot. And as you listen to this, please don't be thinking, oh, I'd never do that. Instead, listen for how the challenges this pilot encountered started out relatively benign, with an electrical failure, but then gradually started to snowball. In some ways, this is much like the boiling frog urban legend that describes how a frog put in lukewarm water with the temperature slowly rising will not perceive any danger to itself. And like the frog, humans are particularly poor at recognizing slow, gradual change. And this accident creeped up on the pilot in a very slow, measured pace. And yet the signposts were there. If only he could have sensed the temperature of the water around him slowly increasing. As pilots, we should always be playing the what-if game in flight and come up with alternatives as issues occur. So listen for the issues that occurred on this flight and project in your mind how they might become more problematic later in the flight. And think about alternatives you might consider in a similar situation. And my thanks to listener Mark Sletton for bringing this accident to my attention. He wrote in part, quote, "I don't recall hearing you discuss this crash on your show, but there are a tremendous number of lessons to be learned here. The gist is an experienced airline pilot crashed a Cessna 150 near the airport of intended landing around 10 p.m. He and his teenage son had been flying all day, having departed the St. Louis area in the morning on a commercial flight to retrieve the Cessna from an airport in New York." And he goes on to mention some of the details of the flight, which I'll talk about in a minute. He also wrote that a coworker of his who was related to the pilot was determined to understand what had happened. He and everyone in the family revered the pilot and thought he was the consummate professional. Local news interviewed workers at the airport where the pilot flew, and everyone believed that something must have gone horribly wrong with the airplane for such a skilled and competent pilot to crash. My coworker was in that camp until the NTSB final report came out. It was really sad to see him realizing the truth. And Mark says, "I'll never understand how a professional pilot can make so many bad decisions, especially when he knew he was setting an example for his son, who was to follow in his father's footsteps as a professional pilot." And he says, "This accident generated a lot of soul-searching on my part. I was a KC-135 boom operator in the Air Force for 20 years, and although I don't fly professionally any longer, I try very hard to bring the professionalism I learned in the Air Force to my personal flying. Seeing the kinds of mistakes the professional pilot involved in this accident made, I've concluded that professionalism is not a panacea. It's a powerful tool, but it's only part of a toolkit. The rest of the tools in the kit cannot be ignored just because you believe you behave professionally." All right, let's talk about the accident. And just so that you understand the stakes involved here, let me read from the obituary of the accident pilot. It says that the pilot, age 56, died when the Cessna 150 he was piloting with his son crashed while trying to land in Festus, Missouri. He was born June 13th, 1962 in Topeka, Kansas. He grew up around airplanes. He started flying when he was just 13. From there, he joined the U.S. Army. He later transferred to the U.S. Air Force and finally to the Iowa National Guard. During this time, he also flew medevac helicopters, most notably for the University of Iowa Hospital. Once retired from the military, he began flying commercially for American Airlines. He was very active in the local aviation community where he lived in Hillsboro, Missouri, and was a CO in the Missouri Commemorative Air Force. In his free time, he was absolutely devoted to his children. He would carry their pictures with him and talk about them to anyone who would listen. He was a true nature lover and was always excited to talk about his hummingbirds and the waterfall he always wanted in his backyard. He was survived by 3 children and his fiancée. His remains will be buried in his hometown of Collins, New York, along with those of his son. Now, ironically, his hometown in New York is where this final flight originated. Now, from the obituary of his son, it says that he was 20 years old. It says from an early age, 2 things were clear. He loved his friends and family, and he was going to be a pilot. He always knew how to light up a room and could tell you when you needed a hug or a shoulder to cry on. He was always a hardworking kid, whether it was with Maxwell Construction, Texas Roadhouse, or at home fixing his trucks. He and his dad would spend entire days with each other repairing and refurbishing cars, boats, and planes. He always said he was learning to become a pilot just like his dad. He had been preparing for flight school. The day before the accident, he had piloted a plane himself for 2 hours and said it was the best 2 hours of his life. Thus, it can only be said that he died doing what he loved. Okay, now I'm going to read from the NTSB report and from some newspaper stories. On September 20th, 2018, about 10:30 p.m. Central Time, a Cessna 150H, November 7152 Sierra, sustained substantial damage when it was involved in an accident near Festus, Missouri. The pilot and passenger sustained fatal injuries. The pilot and his son were relocating the airplane from upstate New York to Festus Memorial Airport, FES, Festus, Missouri. Family members of the pilot reported that the purpose of the flight was for the pilot to travel to Collins, New York, to retrieve the airplane and bring it to FES. The airplane was going to be used for flight instruction for the pilot's son, who was also traveling with the pilot at the time of the accident. The pilot worked professionally as a commercial airline pilot and previously as a helicopter air ambulance pilot. The airplane was owned by the pilot's father and was stationed at a private residence with a private airstrip. The pilot's father and the pilot had an open-ended agreement that the pilot would eventually travel to Collins, New York, to retrieve the airplane. On September 20th, 2018, the pilot traveled from St. Louis, Missouri to Buffalo, New York via commercial airline. The pilot and his son were picked up from the airport by a family member and transported to the private airstrip. The pilot departed from the private airstrip around 2 p.m. Eastern Time. The cross-country flight consisted of travel through Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. Receipts provided by a family member and found in the wreckage show that the pilot had refueled the airplane 3 times during the trip. The first refueling stop was at the Chautauqua County Dunkirk Airport, that's DKK, in New York, at 2:34 p.m. for 13.4 gallons of fuel. The distance between the private airstrip in Collins, New York, and DKK is about 19 miles. The second refueling stop was at the Knox County Airport for India 3 in Mount Vernon, Ohio, at 5:53 Eastern Time for 16.5 gallons of gas. The distance between DKK and 4I-3 is about 226 miles. The third refueling stop was at I-34 for 13.6 gallons of fuel at 8:06 p.m. Eastern Time. The distance between 4 India 3 and India 34 is about 174 miles. The distance from I-34 to FES is about 275 miles. The pilot and passenger communicated with the pilot's fiancée via text messages during the trip. They told her that the airplane was experiencing, quote, a small electrical problem, and stated that their estimated time of arrival would be determined at the next fuel stop just before dark. After their fuel stop at India 34, they estimated their ETA at FES would be about 10:15 p.m. Central Time. He asked the fiancée to be stationed on the north end of runway 10 with a flashlight to help vector the plane in for landing. The pilot directed the fiancée, quote, lights on the north end pointing north. They also stated that they would attempt to activate the airport lighting system with a handheld radio, but they were unsure if the radio had enough battery power to perform the task. During the last leg of the flight, they indicated that they had, quote, picked up a headwind and further extended their ETA until 10:20 p.m. The pilot's fiancée reported that she went to the end of the runway with the flashlight on, and the pilot attempted to land, but she was unsure if the airplane touched down on the runway due to the dark night conditions. She further reported that the airplane was blacked out and did not have any exterior lights on. The last text message from the pilot stated, keep light on. After several minutes of not seeing or hearing the airplane, she tried contacting the pilot multiple times with no response before contacting law enforcement. The wreckage was located the following morning in a tree-covered swamp about 1/4 mile southeast of the departure end of runway 19. And separately, I read that the search was delayed in the morning because of rain in the area. Now, manufacturer guidance stated that following an electrical system failure, the pilot should land the airplane as soon as practical. However, the pilot chose to both initiate and continue the flight into dark night conditions with a known electrical problem to an airport that required him to activate the runway lights. Though the extent of the pilot's pre-flight and in-flight fuel planning could not be determined, it is possible that the airplane consumed more fuel than planned, as the passenger indicated that the airplane had encountered a headwind in flight, and it is likely that the absence of a fuel quantity indication contributed to the fuel exhaustion. Based on the location of the airplane relative to the runway, it is likely that the pilot initiated a go-around following the first landing attempt. During the go-around, the airplane experienced a total loss of engine power, and the pilot subsequently failed to maintain airspeed and exceeded the airplane's critical angle of attack, which resulted in an aerodynamic stall and impact with terrain. And the NTSB says probable cause, a total loss of engine power due to fuel exhaustion, and the pilot's subsequent exceedance of the airplane's critical angle of attack, which resulted in an aerodynamic stall. Contributing to the accident was the pilot's decision to initiate and continue the flight into dark night conditions with a known electrical problem. Here's some additional information. The airport, which closed last year, had one asphalt runway, 10 and 19. Now, that's a little odd because that should be 10 and 18, but perhaps the runway was a little crooked. It says that it was 2,202 feet long and 46 feet wide, so relatively short and considerably more narrow than most runways. It says the airport lighting system consisted of runway edge lights, medium-intensity runway lights, along with runway and identifier lights. The lights could be turned on by a pilot by keying the aircraft's microphone a set number of times on the aircraft's CTAF frequency or by turning on a switch at the main hangar. At the time of the accident, the pilot was employed as an airline pilot. The pilot held a mechanic certificate with airframe and power plant ratings. According to the pilot's employer, pilot's most recent flight with the company was on September 19th, 2018, which was the day before the accident. So the pilot worked a full day flying for the airline and then got up early the next day to fly to New York and then to fly to Missouri in the Cessna 150 all on the same day. The pilot's son held an FAA third-class medical, but did not hold any airman certificates and did not have any reported flight time on the date of his examination. The Cessna 150H Pilot's Operating Handbook, or POH, stated that the maximum capacity for both fuel tanks was 26 gallons, 13 gallons in each tank. The POH further stated that the usable fuel amount for all flight conditions was 22.5 gallons total, and the unusable fuel amount was 3.5 gallons. The Textron Aviation Pilot Safety and Warning Supplements discussed electrical power failures. This document states in part, the pilot should maintain control of the airplane and land when practical if an electrical power loss is evident. If an electrical power loss is experienced, continued flight is possible, but should be terminated as soon as practical. Such things as fuel quantity and engine temperature indicators and panel lights may no longer work. And so once this airplane lost all electrical power, they no longer had any fuel gauges. The wreckage was situated about 1/4 of a mile southeast of the departure end of runway 19 and about 440 feet above mean sea level. Flight control continuity was established for the airframe. All structural components of the airplane were located at the accident site. The airplane sustained substantial damage to both wings, the fuselage, and the empennage. Both wings sustained substantial impact damage from contact with trees. The fuel tanks remained intact, and a total of 2.25 gallons of fuel were extracted from the two fuel tanks. The propeller blades did not exhibit cord-wide scratches or torsional deformation. The alternator and the voltage regulator were examined and functionally checked. The alternator performed normally with no malfunctions or failures, but the voltage regulator was inoperable. The voltage regulator was manufactured around 1976. There was no life limit or replacement interval specified. Review of the airplane's maintenance records did not indicate how long the voltage regulator had been installed on the accident airplane. With the exception of the voltage regulator, no pre-impact mechanical malfunctions or failures with the airframe and engine were noted. Now let's talk about the pilot's decision-making. He clearly had an electrical failure, and he knew about this issue before he took off on the last leg, knowing that it would soon be dark. Now, an electrical problem in the daytime is much less severe of an issue than an electrical problem at night. With a complete electrical failure in this particular Cessna 150, you could not operate the flaps. And I know that because I learned to fly in two different Cessna 150s, a 1964 model with manual flaps, and a 1967 model, the same exact year as this accident aircraft, and it had electric flaps. Also, with an electrical failure, you won't have fuel gauges. Furthermore, the in-cockpit lighting in these older Cessna 150s was absolutely abysmal. It consisted of a single red light above and slightly behind your head, which provided a tiny amount of light on some of the instruments in the instrument panel. And if you were tall like me, your shoulders blocked that light from reaching the lower instruments in the panel. And if this airplane had an aftermarket intercom added, well, that too wouldn't have worked. So now you'd have to take your headset off and yell at each other to communicate. And that's how I learned to fly in a Cessna 150. We had no headsets, and the CFI and student would yell at each other in flight to communicate. I can only imagine the fatigue this pilot was feeling. If you've ever flown for a few hours in a piston aircraft without a headset or with one ear uncovered so that you can hear the other person, you know what I mean. The pilot took off at 2 p.m. Eastern Time and crashed about 10:30 p.m. Central Time. So they were flying for 9.5 hours, including time for fuel stops. That is a very long time to be flying an airplane, even if you were to have a very good noise-canceling headset on the entire time. Now, if these were the only issues, the pilot probably could have succeeded. But the cardinal sin was trying to land at a small airport without any runway lights. I can think of at least two other accidents, one fatal and one with injuries, in which pilots were foolish enough to try to land at an unlit airport. One was at the Ukiah, California airport many years ago. That pilot survived, though the NTSB investigation found that the lights were NOTAMed out of service, so the pilot should have known not to land there. The other involved a CFI and a student, coincidentally also in a Cessna 150 like the accident aircraft, and it too was low on fuel and it had an electrical failure. In that case, the student turned on a flashlight, blinding the CFI just as he landed, And as I recall, one of them died, though I don't recall which one did. What were the alternatives? Well, there were many, and hopefully you've already been thinking about them. Probably the best one would have been to land before it was dark and get a motel room and figure out what to do in the morning. Presumably, they could have hand-propped the plane in the morning to start it and continued to their destination and land in the daytime. Or they could have stopped in the daytime, rented a car, and driven the rest of the way home. Or they could have stayed overnight in a hotel and had a friend fly out to pick them up the next day. Both would have involved leaving the airplane at the airport, but that would have been a small inconvenience compared to having two funerals. Or, once they had made the bad decision to take off at night with a known electrical problem, they could still have elected to land short of their destination at a continuously lit airport. Many continuously lit airports are towered, so it's possible this high-time pilot was unfamiliar with landing with no radio at a towered airport at night, and he might have even been concerned that it could result in a violation. Now let me tell you my experience with that. I once landed at an international airport in a Class Charlie at night with no radio. It was in an old Cessna 170 taildragger that was available for rent at San Jose International Airport. And at some point during the flight, a fuse blew. Yes, that airplane had fuses, not circuit breakers. And I lost all electrical power. I don't recall where I was flying from or how I approached the airport, but I remember being on left downwind for the old runway 29, which has since been closed. I had hoped to see a light gun signal on downwind, but didn't. So I made a large 360 and re-entered the downwind. Again, no light gun signal. So I decided to land and hope that I saw a light gun signal on final. I turned final and didn't see a light gun signal, but I landed anyway. After I pulled off the runway near the base of the tower, I looked up and saw a green light from the tower. So I taxied to parking, and that was the end of it. I never heard anything more about it. The pilot might have also pulled off this dangerous stunt of trying to land at night with just a flashlight illuminating the runway if he hadn't run out of gas. As the airplane climbed out after its first attempt to land, what little gas remained would have flowed to the back of the fuel tanks as they pitched up. With so little fuel in the tank, it would have uncovered the tube through which the fuel flows to the engine. The engine-driven fuel pump would have begun sucking air, and moments later the engine quit. At this point, the pilot's odds of survival dropped to almost zero. He was in a climb attitude, in a pitch-black cockpit where at best his son was illuminating the flight instruments with a flashlight over a forest. He had used up all of the extra margin that pilots try to build into every aspect of a flight. And because he steadfastly stuck with his original plan, even when faced with multiple red flags, they both paid the ultimate price. Now, why did this pilot box himself into a corner when his thousands of hours of professional flying should have steered him toward a better set of decisions? Why did he steadfastly stick to his original flight plan when all evidence suggested it was no longer viable? And why was he willing to put himself and, more importantly, his son at such high levels of risk? Now, there are many possible reasons why he chose to continue this flight, and we'll certainly never know for sure. But, for example, it's entirely possible this pilot had plans for the following day, and stopping to spend the night along the way would get in the way of the plans he made. Clearly, he'd already scheduled things tightly. He'd been flying for the airline the day before and planned this long trip to all fit into one day. Why not take it at a more leisurely pace since he went to his hometown and he had his son along with him? Why not spread the trip out over 2 days rather than make it a rushed affair where everything would have to work perfectly for the plan to work? And that reminds me of something I learned from one of my bosses, Bill Camp, in my first management job at Hewlett-Packard. As I recalled, we were talking about budgeting, and Bill said something like, "There are always unexpected problems. You don't know what they will be, but you can plan for there to be a problem." Good advice for young managers and for pilots. Bill, by the way, later went on to become the mayor of Pacific Grove, California, and I'm sure that advice served him well. Getting back to the accident, perhaps the pilot continued the flight because he had made a commitment for the following day, which was a Friday, and he didn't want to let people down. These kinds of pressures, where pilots don't want to disappoint other people, are almost always self-imposed. If you, as a pilot, were to say to people to whom you've made a commitment, "Doing this flight might be a little more risky than usual, but I'm doing it because I don't want to let you down." In that situation, everyone would tell you, "Don't worry about it. That commitment isn't worth taking on additional risk just so you can be there on time." And yet as pilots, I think we like to show off our skills, demonstrate the utility of our airplanes and how they save us time and how they can help us pull off great feats that non-pilots aren't able to accomplish. Or maybe as a former helicopter medevac pilot, this pilot was used to taking on greater risk than most of us, perhaps flying his helicopter at night in poor weather to help save the lives of patients. The problem with flying in risky situations and surviving is that a pilot might conclude that he or she can therefore always survive any risky situation they decide to get themselves into. So perhaps this pilot had a higher tolerance for risk than most of us because he'd survived prior risky situations in the military and as a medevac pilot. Or perhaps the pilot succumbed to continuation bias. Let me read now from the FAA's CFIT and Plan Continuation Bias Sheet. It says, quote, psychologists call the continuation of an original plan, even when information suggests the plan should be abandoned, continuation bias. Pilots more commonly refer to it as get-there-itis. It's an unconscious bias that can appear stronger the closer you get to accomplishing an activity, example, approach to landing. A pilot may become so focused on completing their mission that they also overlook serious flight hazards along the way, like elevated terrain or other obstructions, creating the potential for a CFIT accident. Pilots should realize that a diversion to an alternate should be deemed a success, not a failure. Just don't wait too long to divert, as this can greatly limit your options. What I've noticed over the years is that many accidents on really long trips across the country occur during the last few miles of the trip. People are so close to their destination that they will push on in spite of considerable odds. Perhaps they push on because their goal was to land the plane at their intended destination. But that should never be your goal. Our goal should always be to make a safe landing somewhere, anywhere. And here's the hard truth. Many of us have thousands of hours of safe flying and consider ourselves to be excellent pilots. But sadly, all it takes sometimes is one mistake to end it all, though usually it takes 2 or 3 mistakes in a row. The universe just doesn't care how smart you and I are or how accomplished we are as pilots. If you start making mistakes and don't stop yourself from making additional mistakes, you can die in an aircraft. And if you were to die in a plane crash, I can tell you exactly what people would say at your funeral. At all the pilot funerals I've been to, someone always says, he was such a good pilot. And you know what? Usually they're correct. Good pilots still make mistakes. And sometimes good pilots make a mistake and then another mistake and don't realize that they need to break the chain of mistakes and get on the ground now. As pilots, you and I are not Superman or Superwoman, as the case may be. And even if we were, even Superman wasn't immune to kryptonite. We all have our own kryptonite. If you constantly push things to the limit when you fly, someday you may push it too far and suddenly encounter a little kryptonite where you didn't expect to find it. That's why it's so important to build extra margin into everything we do as a pilot. When you're done pre-flighting, take that extra walk around the plane to see if everything looks right, that you didn't leave a tow bar attached or leave chocks in front of the wheels. If you're calling a Class Delta tower, don't wait until you're right at the edge of their airspace to call. Call a few miles early. If you're trying to avoid airspace, don't fly right up to the edge of the airspace. You'll leave a half mile or more between you and the airspace. And commit to best practices and follow them every single time. If you're all seatbelted in the airplane and ready to start and suddenly realize you've forgotten to sump the fuel tanks, take off the seatbelt, get out of the plane and do it. And have a rule that nobody climbs out of the airplane with the engine running. And don't violate that rule, even if you worry that it may be hard to restart a hot engine. As pilots, most of the time, we know the right things to do. The challenge is for us to do the right thing every single time we fly so that we build lots of margin into all of our flying, and we don't need to be Superman to save ourselves when we box ourselves into a corner. So remember when you're flying a long trip across the country that no long cross-country flight plan survives unscathed after takeoff. Things will never be exactly as you planned, and so expect to have to make some adjustments to your plan. And my thanks to Mark Slutton for bringing this accident to my attention. If you have feedback or insights about this episode or anything else you'd like to share, please go on out to aviationnewstalk.com, click on Contacts at the top of the page, and send me an email. And of course, I'll read some of your emails on a future show. So until next time, fly safely, have fun and keep the blue side up, and remember that you can always go around.